Hello class, this is Professor Boyer, and in this lecture we will be covering Ralph McInerny's Ethica Thomistica, Chapter 3, concerning ultimate end and moral principles. So in this chapter, Dr. McInerny continues his investigation of moral principles and of the nature of Thomistic morality by looking at how the ultimate end is used to determine the principles or rules of morality. So, in the second chapter, we considered an analysis of morality and moral action that could be described as an ends-means model. On this model, we say that the ultimate end is the first principle of moral consideration, and therefore all actions are to be judged to be good if they are productive of or directed towards this ultimate end, which is happiness. So an action, if it is a true means to a good end, it is good insofar as it is suitable for accomplishing the end. An action that does not accomplish the good end would be deemed to be bad because it does not help us get to our goal. So our goal, our ultimate purpose, is held to be the standard against which we judge all actions. A non-moral case of this would be if you were trying to get to Dallas. You're going on a road trip to Dallas, and you would judge and evaluate different routes that your GPS might give you based on whether or not they got you to Dallas. So if your GPS got really screwy, for example, and it directed you to Austin rather than to Dallas, you would say, that's not a very good route because it doesn't get you to Dallas. Or if you had a route that went through Austin to Dallas rather than straight up I-45 or even going up through Waco and then to Dallas, we would say, that's not as good of a route, is it? Because it does not help us get to our destination as easily. Now this model of analyzing moral decisions can be contrasted with a different model, the principal application model. On the principal application model, we're presented with a number of highly general precepts whose application to our lives constitutes the moral task. On this, we have general principles, general rules of morality, and we consider these rules and then we apply them to the particular actions that we are considering. And so the evaluation of actions on a principal application model states that we begin by judgments about the kinds of actions that are good or bad, and we determine whether or not those rules apply to the particular cases in front of us. So if we have a general moral law against murder, we would consider the particular action in front of us and say, is this a case of murder? If it is, we then determine that this particular action that we're about to perform, is evil because it's murder, and according to our moral principle, murder is wrong. Now, these two models might seem to be completely opposed to each other. One begins with the goal and evaluates actions based on whether or not they achieve the goal or are directed towards the goal, and the other begins with a set of rules or laws which we must follow, and then evaluates actions based on whether or not they conform to the rules of morality. However, for Aquinas, these two models actually overlap and complement each other as far as the principal application model concerns what kind of actions, understood generally, are compatible with human perfection. Thus, they reinforce one another. We derive principles from evaluating the ends of human life, what actions are fulfilling, and then look at the means that are properly conforming to that end. And based off of that, we then determine our principles. So we look at the end, and we look at particular actions, and we say, is this an action that achieves the end? And if it's an instance of an action achieving that end of human happiness, then we say it's good. If there's an action which is not achieving the end of human happiness, then we say it's a bad action. And this forms our principles, our set of moral rules and laws. These are then applied to the particular actions or means we use to try to achieve our end, and these principles are applied to our own perceptions about what the end is, and in doing so, we judge our actions and our own opinions about what is right or wrong against these principles, which are derived from a consideration of the universal good for human nature. Now, in light of this, since we are basing the idea of what is good and the principles about goodness and about how we ought to act based off of our ultimate goal, Ralph McInerny here decides that he's going to consider the is-ought distinction, or the is-ought fallacy as some call it. Now, we did cover this earlier in the semester using David Oderberg, but Dr. McInerny gives a slightly different argument, although similar to those given by Oderberg, whereas Oderberg focused on the nature of facts and what a fact was. McInerny instead considers the basis behind the is-ought distinction, not in terms of fact, but in terms of the senses of desirable which one might use. So this objection comes from the English philosopher G.E. Moore. The objection goes something like this. There are two senses of the word desirable, and we cannot use them interchangeably. So the first sense of desirable, or desirable one, subscript 1, is that which individuals actually desire. So, for example, if I desire to be rich and famous, we would say fame and riches are desirable one for me because I actually desire them. On the other hand, the second sense of desirable that we often use is the idea that something is objectively or intrinsically desirable. That is, it's something which is good and which ought to be desired. So Moore claims that you cannot claim that because something is actually desired by individuals, that therefore it is intrinsically desirable in itself. Or put another way, just because people think something is good doesn't mean that it's good. Now, this is obviously true in many ways. Just because I think that getting money and devoting my entire life to amassing wealth is desirable and a good idea, and therefore any action which gets me rich, including robbing banks, for example, or cheating and swindling stockholders out of their money, might be good, doesn't mean that those actions are actually good or something I should desire. So Moore definitely has a point there. However, he goes one step further, saying that we can't ever have any basis for saying what we ought to desire by looking at what people actually desire. That is, there's no natural object of desire that we can use, or no actual object of desire that we can use to determine what we should want. Now, Dr. McInerny's reply to this, though, is that Moore is being a little too broad and he's not getting fine-grained enough. So, whatever is desirable in the first sense, that is, whatever is actually desired, is desired because we think it's desirable. But why do we think it's desirable? Because it conforms, or we believe it, at the very least, we believe it meets a standard of what is good. And that standard of what is good is what we naturally desire. So the idea of good or desirability is what is perfective of us as humans. So therefore, if I desire massive wealth, I desire massive wealth because I believe it to be perfective of me as a human being. So desirable, in the first sense, although what is actually desired might be wealth or fame or honor or power, the reason why I desire it, or the aspect under which I desire it, is this formality, that it is something I believe to be perfective of me. And as McInerny points out, we naturally desire our own perfection, so something is desirable in the first sense, is actually desired if it is thought to be perfective of us. Now, what is actually perfective of us, what is objectively good, is what we say is desirable in the second sense. So something is desirable in the second sense if it is actually good, if it is actually perfective. Thus, the formality of the first sense of desirable is the essence of the second kind of desirable thing. So we desire everything insofar as we think it's perfective, and there are certain things that actually are perfective of us. So therefore, if something is desirable in the second sense, it has all the qualities that we naturally want. Now, to move between these is to show that the formality of any desirable number one is the essence of desirable number two. So if we want what actually has the formality of number one, we ought to want what is actually meeting that formality. Or to put it another way, we can move between is and ought, because the thing that we ought to desire will be the thing that we naturally actually do want. We're just not very good at determining what meets those qualifications. So the standard or criteria for what should be desired comes from our natural inclination towards perfection, and then what actually is desirable and therefore ought to be desired comes from understanding the objective human nature contained within that. So how do we go about determining what we ought to do? Well, this involves practical reasoning or practical reason. So in order to understand this then, in order to understand the natural law theory that Thomas has, we need to contrast practical reasoning with theoretical reasoning. So theoretical reasoning is an act of reason which considers knowledge, and it's knowledge which we do not directly use for action. Something is theoretical if we seek to know the truth, and something is practical if we seek to know the truth in order that we might use it for practice. I think it's a fairly standard understanding between theoretical and practical. And so McInerny gives us three criteria to distinguish the different degrees of practical thinking. So first concerns what it is that we know. Is the object which our knowledge concerns something we cannot produce, in which case we can only know it in a theoretical way. We can never know it in a practical way because we are not able to use that knowledge to do anything. So for example, if I know the nature of a star, but I cannot actually create a star, then that knowledge is purely theoretical and it's not practical at all. However, if my knowledge concerns something which I can act upon or which I can produce, then the knowledge is practical in terms of the kind of thing known. However, that doesn't mean that I know it in a practical way, because that leads us to our second thing, the mode of knowing. The question then is, if the object of our knowledge is practical, that is, it's something we can make or operate on, does our knowledge of it concern what it is or how to make it or how to use it? So if I know what a car is, and since a car is something that I can use and or make, if my knowledge about it concerns how to use a car or how to make a car, then the way I know about the car is practical. Whereas if I just know properties of cars, when was the car invented, who invented the car, where are cars driven, how many different types of cars there are, we would say that is theoretical knowledge about cars. Not insofar as theoretical as in cars are something that could possibly exist, but insofar as it's not knowledge which is concerned with use. Last, there's the intent of the knower. Now let's say I have knowledge about a car, and I have knowledge about how to use or make a car. Is my knowledge actually being used to drive a car or to make a car? Or do I just know that knowledge and I'm not using it? So this is the intent of the knower. So in this third criteria, we would distinguish, for example, looking up, say, online, how you might, I don't know, how do you make spaghetti carbonara? And even though you don't intend to make spaghetti carbonara, you just happen to be curious. Well, how's it made? And once you learn how spaghetti carbonara is made, you say, all right, now I know how it's made. And you don't do anything with it. In that degree, we would say it's theoretical insofar as you're not actually using it and you're not intending to use it. But if you actually are using it, if you're intending to use and you are using it, then we would say your knowledge is thoroughly practical. This gives us then 3 degrees of practical knowledge. The first is virtually practical knowledge. So this is where the object is practical, but we know it in a theoretical way. That is, we know its nature, and we have a theoretical intention. That is, we're not intending to directly use this knowledge. Although it might get applied later, we're not directly using this knowledge for our own actions. Now, in the case of virtue and morality goes, virtually practical knowledge, virtually here means that it can be, or it has the power to be used practically, but it isn't currently being used practically. Virtually practical knowledge would include the definitions of the good, of virtue, of voluntary, involuntary deliberation, intention. That is, definitions which can be used to guide other degrees of moral reasoning, but which we just try to understand in themselves. So we can view that as factual knowledge about practical matters. Second is formally practical knowledge. This is where we have a practical object and a practical mode. That is, we make moral judgments about different kinds of actions. Our judgments are about how a good should be achieved. So we consider what is good, and we consider particular actions, and we judge whether or not these actions, if performed, would produce the end of the good. So these are formally practical because they concern action rather than the natures of things. These are guided by the first degree, and they will guide the third degree. However, this formal practical knowledge is not actually being used directly. That only comes about in the third degree, completely practical knowledge. That's where our knowledge concerns something practical, it concerns how to act on it, and it is actually being put into practice. So this would be knowledge used while acting, and this is guided by the first and second degrees of knowledge. Now, the different moral judgments about different kinds of actions, so the formal practical knowledge that we gain, which will be used to guide our completely practical knowledge, is called the natural law. Now, to understand the natural law, what is the natural law? We need to look at Aquinas' 4 types of law. Now, this is not given directly in the book, but McInerny does allude to this, so I'm just going to go on about this for a little bit, and then we'll move on. So Aquinas distinguishes 4 kinds of law, and for Aquinas, a law is a command or an imperative derived from a competent authority, which binds. So he gives us 4 types of law. Now, all the types of law, 2 through 4, are instances of the first type, the eternal law. And the eternal law refers to all the laws that govern the universe, all laws or all necessities that concern all of the universe. So the source of these laws are God, and they include both moral laws that apply to human beings and just physical laws of nature. So all the regularities Aquinas holds can be understood as laws or law-like, and thus they are held to be theoretical in their objects. However, there are certain laws or regularities, that is, there are certain ways that things do or ought to behave that are not theoretical, but rather are practical in their object. And these are what make up the natural law, which is a subset of the eternal law. So these are humans' participation in the eternal law. Humans' participation in the eternal law is the natural law. The source, as we said, is God, and this includes all the moral principles or precepts concerning actions related to goodness. Since we are naturally inclined towards goodness, it's a natural law that human beings are necessarily desiring the good. However, since we have free choice, the way that we achieve the good is not necessitated the way the law of gravity is. That is, we don't have to follow the natural law, i.e., it's possible not to follow the natural law. So the natural law is different from the other parts of the eternal law as far as physical bodies don't choose whether or not they will obey the law of gravity, whereas we can, unfortunately, disobey moral laws concerning, say, murder or theft. Third, there's the human law. And human law are laws that human governments create that fill in areas where the natural law permits several possibilities. So, for example, we would say it's a natural law, it's an objective moral truth that we shouldn't hurt other people and we should avoid harming others whenever possible. Well, one way to avoid harm is to, in the case of places where there are cars, that to have everyone drive on the same side of the road. However, it's not objectively right or objectively wrong for everyone to drive on the left side as opposed to the right side of the road. So insofar as there are several possible ways that natural law can be carried out, but there should only really be one way that everyone does it, right? If I drove on the right side, you drove on the left side, that would not be very good. That would lead to accidents. So we all need to drive on the same side of the road. And so this is where the human law comes in. Human laws, distinctly human laws, are determinations of vague areas or of generalities in the natural law. However, that's not to say that all human laws are in accord with natural law insofar as a government could pass unjust laws, laws that conflicted with the natural law. These laws would lack moral authority. So, for example, in Nazi Germany, the laws concerning the Jews obviously went against the natural law, even though they came from a human government, in which case they were unjust and were not actually binding on our consciences. Last, there's the divine law. These are commands that are divinely revealed to men through Scripture, or through the prophets, or through direct divine revelation. And the source of these is God. Now, this includes parts of the eternal law that we might not be able to discover on our own, or which would be hard for some to discover on their own. So the Ten Commandments, for example, are something that we know through divine revelation because they're in Scripture. God directly told Moses to tell everyone these Ten Commandments. However, Aquinas maintains that we can know those Ten Commandments on our own using reason alone. So, for example, thou shalt not steal is something we can figure out without God having to directly tell us. However, since it's not easy for people to realize that you should never steal from others, as opposed to you should only not steal from your friends, which I think is what most people would be inclined to think, or you should only not steal if you're going to get caught, which many people are inclined to think, right? Or think about murder, right? It's not obvious that murder is objectively wrong, and so obvious that everyone knows it and always acts according to that because many people throughout history have thought that murder was okay if I don't like the guy, or if I can get rich by killing him, or if he's a threat to my safety. If I'm a criminal and I break into a house and I might get turned in, then I can murder the homeowner. Well, obviously these people haven't really figured out that murder is always wrong. Yes, and so that's where the divine law comes in. All right, turning to the natural law. The natural law consists of precepts, the first principles of morality, and derived conclusions. These precepts are commands or judgments about what you should or should not do, the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots. Now these precepts, the first precepts, are per se nota. That means they're known through themselves. And they do not need to be demonstrated. This doesn't mean that they don't need to be discovered or reflected upon, but it means that their truth does not depend on some prior truth. They are not necessarily self-evident to all men, but they are self-evident in themselves. That is, once you understand what the terms mean, they're seen to be true immediately just from what the terms mean, right? So, good is that which is desirable and perfective. Evil is that which is harmful and therefore undesirable. We recognize that something that is perfective should be sought, and that which is harmful should be avoided. Very simple. So this is obviously self-evident once you know what good and evil mean. It doesn't need to be demonstrated that the perfective and the satisfying is to be done. Okay, so the first precept then is good is to be done and pursued and evil avoided. So in saying this, Aquinas addresses both actions, which are a means to an end, and the goals or ends that we set for ourselves. So good is to be done, that is, good actions are to be done, and good ends are to be pursued. Evil actions and evil ends are to be avoided. Now this first precept is the most general one. All of the precepts are derived by applying this principle to our understanding of particular cases. So in the case of murder, we say murder is evil, and we apply the first precept of natural law, evil is to be avoided, and we derive, therefore, the moral law, murder is to be avoided, or thou shalt not murder. This might seem rather simplistic and obvious, but it does come down to determining that murder is something that is intrinsically evil. And it's not something that's been obvious to all people at all times. Cain and Abel being the chief example, or rather the first example. So with this in mind, let's turn to an examination of the first precept in a little more depth. So Dr. McInerny brings up the first precept and notes that it's the most general. And it's the most general because all the precepts are derived from applying this principle to particular cases. The first precept concerns the formality of goodness, and not just the formality, but also the essence of the true good. If something is truly good, then it should be done or pursued. If something is truly evil, it should be avoided. And since this contains that formality, and not just the formality, but the formality understood as objectively present, or truly present, we see that from this, it contains virtually within itself all other precepts. Every single thing that's good, as we talked about in the last lecture, good being an analogous term, every sense of good is contained in the word good here. Every sense of evil is contained in the word evil here. Therefore, we might rephrase it, all truly good things, all truly good actions are to be done, and all truly good ends pursued, and all truly evil actions and ends avoided. Therefore, if we determine that a particular action is truly good, then we see that since it is truly good and all truly good actions are to be done, therefore this action should be done. Now there are two objections that Dr. McInerny considers here. The first comes from Eric Darcy, and he claims that this is a meaningless tautology, that we're saying good is desirable and evil isn't. And so what this ultimately ends up sounding like is that we're just saying good is good. If something is to be done, then it's desirable. So he's saying good is desirable, therefore good is good, and evil is evil. And that's not really saying anything. We're just saying what's good is good and what's evil is evil. Germain Grisey, on the other hand, objects that this formulation of the ultimate rule of morality is too broad. That is, it would allow us to draw conclusions that are good, such as murder is wrong, but also allow us to draw false judgments like murder should be performed. If you believe mistakenly that murder is good, you might then apply the first principle of natural law and say all good should be done. Murder is good, you falsely think, and therefore you would conclude, therefore murder should be done, or thou shalt murder. Now, because that's obviously mistaken judgment, Grisey thinks that this is a bad formulation of the first principle of morality. However, as Dr. McInerny points out, both fail to recognize that this precept uses the second sense of desirable. It uses the second sense of desirable. If we go back to our different senses of desirable here, we see that the first sense is what individuals actually desire. The second sense is what individuals ought to desire. That is, the first sense is the formality of desirability, or the formality of goodness, that is, the idea of something as perfective. And the second sense isn't just the idea of something as perfective, but the reality of something as perfective. Therefore, the problem with the two objections is that they don't realize that Aquinas is using only the second sense. So what has the appearance of perfectiveness and actually is perfective is to be done and pursued, and what actually is harmful is to be avoided. And if we do this, we then obviously, to recognize Griset's objection, we obviously must be careful about making our judgments about whether particular actions are perfective or harmful, but that doesn't mean that the first precept would allow us to draw false conclusions like murder is okay, because that's only drawn by misapplying the first precept, because we're applying it to something that isn't truly beneficial. And if we look at it carefully, our syllogism will not actually conclude. So then, let's talk about these derived precepts of the natural law. So, as McInerny gets into, human beings are naturally inclined towards multiple goods or perfections. So there are many things that are perfective of us and which we naturally desire and are inclined towards. So self-preservation, growth and development, reproduction, sense knowledge, pleasure, etc. Now, these goods are perfective of us, and because they're perfective of us and are naturally perfective of us, we notice that we are naturally drawn towards them. We all want to preserve our lives. We all want to grow and develop and perfect ourselves in those ways. We are naturally drawn towards reproduction, hence our sexual drives. We naturally desire to know things and to see things, and we desire pleasure. However, although achieving these goods is perfective of us, and therefore they should be pursued, they shouldn't just be pursued in any old way. And this is where that ends means principle application model distinction comes in. We need to recognize that these goods are perfective of us insofar as we are human, insofar as they constitute part of the human good, insofar as we pursue them in a human way, which is to say, rationally. Therefore, we should pursue self-preservation, growth and development, reproduction, sense knowledge, pleasure, etc., but we must pursue them in a distinctly human way if they are truly to be human goods. And since we must pursue them in a distinctly human way, we there recognize that we must judge them and judge the manner in which we perform them, the way their means to the end, by making sure that we say the self-preservation of a human being, the growth and development of a human being, the reproduction of a human being must be done in a way that is befitting of a human being as a whole. So to pursue the good of sex without doing so consciously, purposefully, and responsibly, that is following reason, would harm us as humans. And so we should not have sex unconsciously, non-purposefully, and irresponsibly. Likewise, we shouldn't pursue self-preservation by murdering and stealing, since as social animals, we are naturally part of a community, and such actions harm other members of the community and harm ourselves as participating in that community. So just because I can preserve my own life and ensure my continued existence by stealing my neighbor's food doesn't mean that that's an acceptable way to achieve the good of self-preservation, because that goes against what is properly fulfilling of me and what are my obligations towards my fellow man. So I can't consider actions in isolation in relation to a particular good. I have to consider how those goods are part of the entire human good, and I cannot go against the entire human good in that way. So the precepts consider these various human actions, as McInerny says, not as means, but as constitutive of the overall human good. And because we consider these various human actions as constitutive of the overall human good, the first principle of practical reason applies to them and allows us to derive these precepts. So to go on a little bit more about the derived precepts. The negative precepts are absolute prohibitions. Something which is evil can never be perfective, no matter how it is done. There's no moral way to murder, or, as you might recall Aristotle saying in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, there's no right way to commit adultery. Now, positive precepts are presupposed by negative precepts. We have to know what we should do in order to understand what is harmful to us. So we must know that self-preservation is good, and we must know what the good things are in order to know what would be harmful to us. However, the positive precepts do not specify down to the last detail how to achieve the goods. There is some leeway based on circumstances. The boundaries, however, within which we can rightly act are drawn up by the accompanying negative precepts. So, to put it a little differently, I need to know what is perfective of me in order to be able to judge if a particular action is harmful, if I'm pursuing that good in the wrong way, right? So if I recognize that sex is good, and then I ask, is having sex with someone who's not my wife good? I will not be able to judge properly whether or not adultery is right or wrong unless I have recognized first that sex is good, but that fidelity is good, that being there for my children, I have an obligation to raise my children and not to father children out of wedlock, that is something which I need to do, that I have an obligation to raise any children as the father and husband of the wife who gives birth to them. So in those cases, Aquinas says we must know the positive precepts first. However, positive precepts, unlike negative precepts, have some latitude insofar as there might be several acceptable ways to achieve the good. A negative precept rules out something which is never acceptable, and as far as it rules out something that's never acceptable, it's exceptionless. It's rigidly drawn as far as it can never be broken. All right. Now, with this in mind, McInerny then turns to considering how Aquinas differs from other moral systems, in particular non-realist systems. So this will probably be a bit familiar, as we will be going over the same material that we went over with the David Oderberg lecture from the first week of class. So he looks at G.E. Moore's so-called naturalistic fallacy. G.E. Moore developed Hume's is-ought distinction to argue that you cannot determine that something's good based off of its natural properties. He said to say something is good because of what it is a fallacy. That is, it is a logical error according to Moore. So he says that it's a logical error because if you explain a good thing's goodness using facts about it, this leads to a tautology because the goodness of a thing ends up being nothing but the facts about it. So you end up speaking in circles. So let us look at this example of the car. A Honda Civic is good. Why is a Honda Civic good? Well, it's good, among other reasons, because it is affordable and reliable. Now, according to Moore, the word good here just means affordable and reliable. The reason or the basis, the justification for saying a Civic is good, according to Moore, is nothing other than what the word good means. So a Honda Civic is good is to say a Honda Civic is affordable and reliable. And he therefore takes these two terms to be completely interchangeable. So if they're completely interchangeable, that means to say a Honda Civic is good because it is affordable and reliable just means a Honda Civic is good because it is good, which isn't really saying anything. Or we say something which is self-evident. A Honda Civic is affordable and reliable because it is affordable and reliable. Well, that's not very helpful, and that's rather meaningless. So Moore held that we could not actually say why something was good based off of what it was. There's no way to go from a fact about the thing to a judgment that it was good or bad, that it should be pursued or should be avoided. However, Peter Geach, another English philosopher who he was a 20th century philosopher. I believe he died maybe 5 years ago, perhaps. Anyway, Peter Geach pointed out the problem with this argument is that good is what we call an attributive adjective. That is, it can only be understood by considering what it is describing, by considering the thing it is an adjective of. So there's two types of adjectives, predicative and attributive. Predicative adjectives, although they may be attached to a noun, are really describing the subject of a sentence. So if we say Tom is a fat philosopher, what we're saying is Tom is fat and a philosopher. Fat here is a description of Tom, not a description of Tom as philosopher. So fat can be understood independently of the noun it is modifying, philosopher. An attributive adjective, on the other hand, such as good, doesn't function this way. Tom is a good philosopher does not mean Tom is good and a philosopher. Rather, we mean Tom is good at philosophy, or Tom is a philosopher who is good as a philosopher. It doesn't mean Tom is good overall. Tom might be a jerk, but maybe he's good at doing philosophy. Tom is a good basketball player. It doesn't mean Tom is a good person. It just means he's good at basketball. Now, we can only understand this by knowing what makes something like a philosopher or a basketball player to be good. We have to consider the natural facts concerning the subject which the attributive adjective good modifies. Therefore, if we go back to the Honda Civic statement, a Honda Civic is good because it is affordable and reliable. It really means a Honda Civic is a good car. And why is it a good car? Because it's an affordable and reliable car. And we know that a car should be, what we mean by good cars, a car should be affordable and reliable. Thus, we have looked at a fact about it, that the Civic is affordable and reliable, and recognized that that is something good. We have derived goodness from looking at a fact. We have gone from is to ought. And that is just in the nature of the term good. It can't be understood in a different way. We actually cannot understand good without defining in terms of facts. Whereas Moore said we can't go from is to ought because it's meaningless. Actually, his understanding would make good meaningless for different reasons, because that's not how it works. All right. After this, then McInerny considers emotivism and non-realism. Now, we've talked about these earlier, so I'm going to just go over this very quickly. So one response to Geach's refutation of Moore, that is to say, one response to natural law, to this objective moral system, is that moral precepts and judgments aren't actually about the natures of things, but they just express our feelings about an action. Nothing, not objective moral properties. That they're subjective judgments. So murder is wrong just means I don't like murder. That's, you might recall, as the relativistic phrase, or boo murder, or ick murder. It just expresses a psychological distaste. Now, these could be called objective insofar as they're grounded in our psychology, but they're not objective in the universal sense that Thomas or any realist system of morality needs, because they're not present in universal human nature, or they're not present outside of human nature in the objects themselves. McInerny then makes clear that non-realism can only be maintained, that is, in a serious way, is by denying that there is any shared objective human nature. That is, by denying that there is anything that is objectively good for me, that there's a nature that I share with you, and therefore, since the nature that I share with you is the same in me and in you, the kind of thing is perfective of me insofar as I'm human will also be perfective of you insofar as you are human. If there is no shared objective human nature, then there is no objective judgment as to what is harmful and what is perfective of human beings. Now, this is best epitomized by the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who is best known for his works Being in Nothingness and Existentialism is Humanism. He was an existentialist philosopher, and the key claim of the existentialist philosophers is that there is no such thing as nature. Things exist, and humans exist, and we exist without a nature, and we therefore exist as a blank canvas, and we create our own nature by our choices and by our actions. So there is no objective right or wrong, since there is no objective standard. We each of us invents our own standard by choosing to determine and define our natures. We are radically free. We are free without any constraints on how we should act. So we must choose how we should act. But how we should act then is entirely dependent on our prior choices. Thus, we invent morality. This, in a way, is a form of nihilism, or you could view it as a form of relativism. But as we noted before, relativism ultimately slides down to nihilism if you don't recognize objective truths, which Sartre would not. Therefore, I just want to return at the end here to something I said before about the flexibility or the vagueness about the moral principles that are in natural law. The positive moral principles, unlike the negative moral principles, do admit of exceptions. Negative moral precepts, the thou shalt nots, are absolute and exceptionless. They must always be followed no matter the circumstances. So lying is always wrong, except in certain cases that does not fly. If murder is always wrong, there is no case in which murder is right. And that is because murder is intrinsically harmful. It's intrinsically unfulfilling. It's intrinsically not perfective of us as human beings. Positive moral precepts, though, the thou shalts, are unchanging. That is, for example, justice is always something that should be done. Charity is always something that should be done. Telling the truth is always something that should be done. However, there may be exceptions where a positive precept no longer applies. So although it might look like the same scenario, the circumstances might change such that the general rule about what is good and perfective does not apply, and the circumstance actually now falls under a negative moral precept. So a famous example, this originally comes from Plato in the Republic, so you might remember this. Book 1 of the Republic, but everyone tends to use it. One should return borrowed property is a rule that we should always follow. We should always return borrowed property. However, we should only return borrowed property when returning borrowed property is perfective and good. So it's a general precept that applies relative to the situation. You wouldn't return a borrowed shotgun if the owner showed up to your house drunk, asking for his gun so he could go shoot someone who insulted him at the bar. So if, in a certain circumstance, following this precept would actually hinder achieving the human good, if it would lead to harm rather than to perfection, it should not be followed. So in this way, the positive moral precepts are relative. That is, they apply relative to the circumstances. They do not change their truth. That is, we do not say that returning what is owed is wrong. We just say returning what is owed in this case turns into aiding and abetting assault or murder. So in that way, Aquinas recognizes that there are relative standards. This is what Aristotle is getting at in his chapter on virtue in Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where he said in chapter 6 that virtue is a mean relative to the individuals. That is, it applies in different ways given the circumstances. So we must always take into account the circumstances to understand what the action we are performing is. However, the general universal nature of good acts is always the same. Justice is always good. The precept to be just doesn't apply in cases where the circumstances are not circumstances where justice is a relevant factor, or where justice in one way is a relevant factor, right? So although it is just to repay my debts and to return what I have borrowed, in this case, this is no longer a case where the action would be just because it is just to help and not to harm. So in such circumstances, we see that the principle to be just still applies, but it applies in a different way than it did before because the circumstances changed. The morality didn't, the circumstances did. And so this is a key difference. This is relative moral principles without being relativistic, without being moral relativism. All right, well, thank you very much for watching this lecture. Please complete the accompanying assignment, and I will be talking to you in the next one.